conference, Migration and Trade Unions, Migrant Labor, Struggles and Challenges for Organizing, is so much at the core of what we seek to do as the GLUE, and what we would like to do even better. That is to build stronger ties between academics and labor activists, and to contribute to broad, inclusive, dynamic labor movements that put the most vulnerable at the center of our struggle. And this most certainly includes migrant workers. This conference takes place at a critical time, a time when, in response to the COVID pandemic, migrants are being pushed out of their jobs, forced out of cities, and in some cases driven out of their countries where many had worked so hard to support their families back home. As noted by Cindy, the challenges they face are enormous, but they are also organizing, fighting back, and deepening their alliances. We want to discuss in the coming 3 days those experiences, learn from them, and explore ways in which we can deepen our cooperation. This first plenary session is designed to set the stage for this discussion with 3 outstanding speakers, Praveen Jha, Michele Ford, and Chidi King. The topic of the session is Situating Migration in Global Labor Transformations. So let me start by introducing our first speaker. Praveen Jha is a professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, and adjunct professor at the Center for Informal Sector Labor Studies with the School of Social Sciences at JNU in New Delhi, India. He also represents the India Master's Program on the International Steering Committee of the Global Labor University. Praveen will speak on neoliberal capitalism and migrants. Praveen, the floor is yours.
Mark, comrades, colleagues, and friends, from my side as well, very warm welcome to everyone for this conference, which has already been introduced. I hope we have very fruitful deliberations and some critical inputs for our discourses and action plans during the next 3 days. It is indeed a pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel on situating migration in global labor transformations. As we know, human mobility under capitalism within and across national boundaries has generated a vast and impressive literature during the last couple of centuries. This panel focuses on migration in the context of transformations in the world of work at the current juncture, which is that of neoliberal capitalism. My brief remarks will be aimed at a couple of economic theoretic considerations central to this broad theme, as my esteemed fellow panelists are likely to take up the political questions central to the current trajectories and challenges pertaining to migration. Furthermore, my observations are confined entirely to transnational mobility. The theme, as all of you would appreciate, is very large, very complex, and we have to be very selective in focusing on some of the key concerns to set the context and the ball rolling. Now, before I come to the current juncture, it is very, very important to underline that in economic analysis and consequent policy prescriptions, the profession is more united in its hostility to free international mobility of workers or citizens than possibly on any other theme. So if you look at a fantastic continuum of coming together between the left and right, probably there's no other theme in economics or economic analysis which has this kind of support, which is indeed very worrisome. So what I'm trying to highlight as my first point is that this opposition to international mobility of workers and citizens, it is not limited only to right-wing conservative economists, but is a common feature among a wide section of progressive economists and social scientists as well. Underlying opposition, which I mentioned, thrives on several arguments, but one of the most important among these is an extremely influential so-called sophisticated theoretical construct due to Heckscher, Ohlin, and Samuelson.
Que se basa en Heckscher, Ohlin, Samuelson, el teorema para el comercio internacional y ventajas comparativas que se ha lanzado hace casi 70 años, que dice básicamente que el comercio internacional
perfect substitutes for international mobility of factors of production, be it labor or any other factor. Thus, in a competitive market economy, the argument goes, there is no rationale whatsoever which could justify transnational mobility of labor, or for that matter, as I said, any other factor of production. If the markets are imperfect, push them in the direction of making them more perfect. But there's no need for labor mobility, so to say. Of course, a great deal of mainstream economic theory and its policy conclusions, as most of you would know and appreciate, remain on very, very slippery terrains. And it's not possible to venture into these issues here. The reason I mentioned Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theorem here was to emphasize a very, very powerful ideological hold that such theories command till date and become very powerful tools and weapons to hide xenophobic prejudices. There is a huge literature which follows in the footsteps of the said theorem and the spirit of the said theorem. Now, I'll not get into lots of very important, supposedly very important contributions and so on. And let me just move fast forward to contemporary capitalism and illustrate almost a very, very widespread, something like a street fight tenor opposition to the idea of free labor mobility in dominant economic and political discourses. The xenophobia and the fear of the migrant other is one which was very well captured in a very pithy phrase few years ago by Juan Martinez Alier, who talked of how the fortress Europe mindset captures almost the entire social science, barring those on the fringes, those who are considered to be in very, very prestigious citadels of disciplines and privilege, etc., how this fortress Europe mindset dominates their thinking. This was several years ago. If anything, the situation has become much worse and far more strident today in the global north, vis-a-vis labor from global south touching their shores. As it happens, and I've been emphasizing this point, the opposition is across ideological divides. And not only that, unfortunately, quite rampant within the working classes themselves. In fact, I would like to remind all of us of Marx's dismay. Karl Marx, when he, in a letter to Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt in 1870, with respect to working class politics in England, had said, every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps. Let me give you the one passage from that letter which captures the spirit of it. He says, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently, he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudice against the Irish worker. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. This is, in a sense, extremely eloquent application to the present day if you think of the kind of hostilities that we notice all around us. Just take English and Irish out of the quotation which I shared with you, put North and South, put all kinds of considerations relating to social geography. Cindy mentioned women. Likewise, we can mention different races, different castes, and so on and so forth. And all these play out very powerfully. So in the present, anyone familiar with the thrust of recent policy discourses, not only in the global north, but also south as well, will recall that it is not only the right-wing populist voices such as Trump's and Orban's, but also Bolsonaro's and Duterte's in the south who have spewed venom against the other and celebrated nativism. This does not come as a surprise. What certainly becomes deeply worrisome when the likes of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, in of course very sophisticated ways, become spokesperson for the Fortress North. And similarly, several high priests of the left, such as Slavoj Žižek, among many others, end up effectively endorsing anti-immigration. A brief write-up in The Economist of 15th February 2020 had a very catchy headline. Immigration to America is down, wages are up. Are the two related? Clearly, the headline was framed in a manner which was intended to answer the question that it asked. And it was very much in the nature of a backhanded compliment to Mr. Trump. I may add here that the above noted piece in The Economist was a very shoddy piece of analysis. In fact, a classic example of a shoddy piece of economic analysis. However, what matters is the sentiment behind that intended conclusion. It would appear that what unites in significant ways from Republicans to Democrats and much of the white working class is indeed such a shared economic worldview, which, as we noted, was deeply sort of distressing for Karl Marx almost 150 years ago. As regards actual historical experiences of large or small waves of transnational mobility under capitalism, their diversity with respect to trajectories and possible explanations, etc., all these constitute a complex terrain, and let me not get into that. But fundamental point is that these depend on the structures of accumulation, which determine the demand for workers at different junctures and thus prospects for mobility otherwise. Indeed, one can recall, not from too distant a past, conducive contexts when labor mobility in general, and from south to north in particular, was considered quite a positive thing. It had a reasonable academic and policy support. This was the best, the best illustration of this we could find in the post-Second World War phase of regulated capitalism, when Northwestern Europe guest workers were encouraged to come in substantial numbers from several countries in the South. However, ascendancy of neoliberalism since 1970s and several tendencies associated with it have resulted in almost a collapse of labor demand in the global economy, and phrases like job loss growth are commonly used to capture the current neoliberal accumulation regime. For reasons of time, I'll not get into too many of these details, but let me just flag a few very pertinent issues. First, a major feature of the current regime is the ascendancy and dominance of a kind of finance capital which does not have a positive synergy with real economy, and thus its pursuit of profit is largely through accumulation and financialized accumulation, which puts a massive squeeze on labor demand. Second, another major feature of the current context is the substantial mobility of capital from north to south, and along with it, increasing capital intensity of economic activities, which in the net compresses labor demand. Further, it becomes an ostensible substitute for prospects for labor mobility in the opposite direction, that is from south to the north. Yet another feature which has received considerable attention in academic and policy discourses pertains to the profound technological transformations through the so-called third and fourth industrial revolutions, which again on balance, at least for the at the current phase, seem to be labor displacing. The above noted tendencies have also resulted in significant changes in distribution of income from wages to profits, which apart from increasing inequalities, contributes to demand deficiency and further slackening of inducement to invest, which makes it almost a vicious circle for the real economy, in particular demand for labor. We may also note that hegemony of new finance pushes nation states, especially in the South, to a massive squeeze in their policy space, often accompanied by deflationary macroeconomic regimes. And final tendency that I'd like to flag here is that neoliberal capitalism has resulted in a massive intensification of the forces of primitive accumulation across the globe, which are aided by the above noted tendencies that I mentioned, and contributes to an aggravation of relative surplus population everywhere. In sum, labor all over the world in varying degrees has been hit hard by the above noted features, which are very powerful markers of contemporary capitalism. These are very, very important in contributing to a disappearance of jobs, and additionally, they threaten prospects of their organization of working class, their bargaining power, empowerment, and so on. It is in such a backdrop that we can make sense of increased hostility to labor mobility across national boundaries, in particular from south to the north. It may be worth recalling a couple of astonishing findings from the Transnational Institute study published in November 2020, just a few months ago. It reports that in 1989, while there were 6 walls, there are now at least 63 physical walls along borders or on occupied territories across the world. Further, it also reports that many more countries have militarized their frontiers through the deployment of troops, ships, aircrafts, drones, etc. In other words, what we have today is the border industrial complex, and we are living in a walled world. Almost everywhere, whatever systems have been set up to protect the rights of migrants, these have come under a lot of stress. And let me just conclude again by recalling a statement from Marx, which was to his address, in his address to the First International in 1867, when he said, "A study of the struggle waged by the English working class reveals that in order to oppose their workers, the employers either bring workers from abroad or else transfer manufacture to countries where there is a cheap labor force. Given this state of affairs, if the working class wishes to continue its struggle with some chance of success, the national organizations must become international. In other words, to my mind, a deeper connect and synergy across workers' movements on different aspects of economics and politics of migration has to be at the center stage to further any progressive agenda for transnational mobility of labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen, and what an important note to end on. So next we have Professor Michele Ford, who's going to be joining us through a video recording. Michele is the director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of Sydney, where she researches labor internationalism and labor activism. Her books include From Migrant Worker to Worker, Global Unions and Temporary Labor Migration in Asia, and I highly recommend it. It's now a required reading in my graduate seminar courses. We've given her a bit extra time, 22 minutes. This is because she will not be participating in the Q&A part of the discussion due to time zone differences. So this gives her a little extra time. Michele's presentation is titled Migrant Organizing as a Pathway to Union Renewal, Experiences from East and Southeast Asia. So over to the recorded presentation by Michele.
Hi, I'm Michele Ford. I'm the director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Sydney. I'm drawing on a book I published with Cornell in 2019 called From Migrant to Worker, which looks at the ways that global unions tried to help local unions think more clearly about temporary labour migration in Asia. But today I'm going to deal with a more narrow aspect of that study, namely, does migrant labour organising actually offer some potential as a pathway to trade union renewal? As you may know, unions from everywhere from Western and Northern Europe have started to work across sectors from varied as care work down to manufacturing to try to organise foreign workers. And we can see this also in Asia, where a great number of the wealthier countries of the region depend on temporary labour migration. You can also see from the Asian context that there are various different responses that you can have to temporary labour migrants in terms of your strategies for engagement, if indeed you decide to engage. And when we're thinking about these strategies, we have to remember that unions don't form their strategies in a vacuum. They're working within not only their own individual culture and the limitations on their resources and their other elements within inside them, but also in the terms of the context of the industrial relations system in which they work, and ultimately the broader social, political and economic system in which they operate. And this is really important for the strategies that they adopt, because strategies that make sense in one context may well not make sense in the other, and vice versa. So when we're thinking about union responses and contextualising them, we really do need to think about variation in labour migration regimes. And by this, I mean how many temporary labour migrants there are, if they're temporary or permanent indeed, what sectors they're employed in, and so on. But also the schemes through which they're admitted to a particular country and the rigidity of their contracts, with the latter being really important because, of course, if you're tied to a single employer, your willingness to actually complain about that employer or engage in collective activism will be much lower than if you've got flexibility to move between employers within a context. The second main aspect is variations in employment relations regimes. And by this, I mean, for example, the reach of an industrial relations system. Does it cover most sectors? Even in Western countries, they often don't. And if they do cover sectors, how well developed is their engagement in that sector? Do they actually intervene in the employment relations that go on in the workplace? The third factor, and this is also very important, are the national and international contours of migrant labour activism. And nationally, we need to think about the political opportunity structures that are available for migrant worker organising. And sometimes these can be really influenced by international factors, but also the relevant importance of unions or NGOs as migrant labour activists and advocates, and the level of migrant labour organising and the effect a capacity of both migrant workers themselves, but also of the unions and NGOs that support them to actually change the way that migrant workers experience their time in the country. Now, if we turn our attention to Asia, as I mentioned before, temporary labour migrants really are a structural feature of Asia's wealthier economies. And here we're talking Japan, not so much, but countries like Hong Kong, countries like Thailand, countries like Singapore. And in these contexts, yes, indeed around the world, labour unions have traditionally been very hostile to foreign workers. But what's interesting in Asia is the extent to which local unions have come under pressure from NGOs working in those contexts, but also the global unions to change their approach. And in response to this pressure, we can see that some key Asian unions have actually quite considerably changed their position on temporary labour migration. But, and this is a topic for another day rather than here, the main argument in the book that I make is that their willingness to act actually strongly correlates with their level of engagement with the global union federations. But today we're thinking about Asia itself, and I also wanted to talk briefly about trade union density, which is often used as a proxy for trade union power. And what we see in Asia is that's really not the case. You can see that in a number of countries in the region, density is actually quite reasonable, but we really have to ask about union militancy, about their level of embeddedness in the industrial relations system to make sense of these numbers. So, for example, we can see that in Taiwan, there's a very high level of trade union density, but this is actually the legacy of a previous authoritarian period rather than a true reflection of union strength today. Similarly, in Singapore, density is almost a quarter to almost 25%, but the unions are very closely tied to government. And so their ability to actually oppose government policy on any issue, but including migration, labour migration, is actually quite low. The irony is that in the Singapore context, this has actually worked in favour of temporary labour migrants because the Singapore government has relied on them so heavily. So let's take a step back for a second and ask what about the questions that this raises. If union movements in Asia are relatively weak, should they actually be engaging with migrant labour at all? What is the impact of engaging with migrant labour on their other work? And what is the potential of success? So, for example, in Thailand, where unions really struggle to recruit even permanent local workers, what really are their chances of reaching out to a precarious group like labour migrants, even if they wanted to? And if they do, how much of an opportunity do they have if they have very little industrial strength to actually influence working conditions for migrants in reality? The second big question is whether there are circumstances where it can actually be beneficial not just to the temporary labour migrants, but to the host country union itself. And here, I think the two key things we need to consider are the nature of their engagement, and that's what I'm focusing on today. But secondarily, does that engagement actually sit on the edge of union activity, or does it actually demand that unions reassess that core activity itself? So, when we talk about modes of engagement, the three main ones you can see in the Asian context are advocacy, servicing, and organising. Advocacy, of course, might be something like pushing the government to have a policy that doesn't return migrants to their home countries as soon as they lose their employment, or better wages in the sector, all those sort of policy issues that we think about. But it's interesting in this context because it actually demands the least internal change. This isn't to say it can't make a real difference, and in some cases it really does. So, for example, in Hong Kong, the HKCTU has had a pro-migrant worker policy for a long time, and it came to advocacy via a quite circuitous route. Its first efforts were actually to get its mainstream affiliates to recruit migrant workers, but in Hong Kong, this was a problematic strategy, in part because local unions don't have much industrial power, and also because most of the foreign workers in the territory are actually domestic workers, and that sector simply wasn't unionised. It has been more recently, but at that time it wasn't. So until about the mid-2000s, the HKCTU really concentrated on supporting migrant domestic worker associations that had been helped to be formed by NGOs, first working with them to advocate for policy changes on issues like wages, and later actually helping them to to register as formal unions, which is possible in the Hong Kong context, unlike most other contexts in Southeast Asia, and brought them into the fold. And this was really useful for the domestic worker associations because it gave them additional legitimacy, made it easier for them to demand things from government. At the same time, it was useful for the HKCTU because in a context where industrial power is low, street-based protests are an important demonstration of union presence and strength. And in recent decades, migrant workers have often made up quite a big proportion of, say, May Day rallies in the territory. So we can see here that it is helpful for the Confederation, but at the same time, it didn't actually demand any real change from the HKCTU's affiliates. And in this way was perhaps a lost opportunity, though one, of course, explained by those sectoral factors I mentioned before. The second major strategy is servicing. And like advocacy, servicing doesn't really require change within the local union. And while it can be helpful for individual migrant workers, it's actually unlikely to promote systemic change. This is the case because, like advocacy, serving tends to be something that a mainstream union does for temporary labour migrants rather than actually through their own structures. So an example in Malaysia is service unions that are affiliated to uni formed a help desk in the mid-2000s that has helped many, many migrant workers and achieved real results. It's staffed by the union affiliates' volunteers, and they've got wages for foreign workers. They've helped them in situations where they're threatening, the government is threatening to expel them before they can go through a court case, all those sorts of issues. But again, it doesn't actually require those local unions to change their internal processes. So it improves, maybe demonstrates an improved attitude towards migrant workers, but it doesn't actually change the way that the unions engage with that constituency, but also with local workers. So then we have organising, and you might decide that I'm going to argue that organising is the way to union renewal. And in some cases, some ways that is my argument, but it's not as simple as that. Organising is interesting because clearly it's the most challenging strategy, the one that requires the most resources. And it's been very controversial in Asia because many unionists actually see it as a waste of time because temporary migrants are only temporary and there's a risk that you invest a whole lot of time and effort into organising them and then they just go home. But if it's done in ways that actually engage with core union business, it actually has the potential, I think, of affecting real change. So when we talk about organising, we have to distinguish between separate organising and integration. Separate organising is where migrant workers are brought into a separate union. In many places, this may be possible, this may not. Where it is possible, it differs from an association, for example, because it's actually recognised, as in Hong Kong in the case of domestic worker unions, as a formal union, and this gives it greater access to the industrial relations system and internationally to bigger organisations like the ILO. In Asia, separate organising is possible in Taiwan quite recently and also in Korea and Hong Kong, of course. But it's not possible in Singapore, in Taiwan, in Thailand, or even in Japan or Malaysia. So if there's no possibility of separate organising, then the only opportunity available to the union movement is to recruit temporary labour migrants into mainstream unions. The question is then, are those unions open to that strategy? And we see, as we do indeed around the world, a lot of hostility, as I mentioned before, remaining towards temporary labour migrants. So if migrant mainstream unions actually want to recruit migrants, they have to think about a few factors. And the first of these is whether they have a presence in the migrant-dense workplaces in the first place. For example, in Korea, as I think I mentioned before, manufacturing is quite heavily unionised in large-scale union workplaces, but in the smaller SMEs, the unions have very little presence, and it's in those SMEs that most migrants are located. Then we also have to think about whether unions have the capacity to reach out to migrants, which have very particular needs, like other precarious workers. And If they don't, are they willing to develop it? And this is a real crux, because if they are willing to develop the capacity to deal with migrant workers, it actually can have a spillover effect into the way that they deal with their local members. And this often depends, I think, on whether unions see migrant labour organising as part of their core work or as something they do on the side, which in many ways is quite similar to the way that they might think about advocacy or about servicing. So, as I said before, in places like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, you can't actually have a separate organising strategy. And we can see that local unions have responded quite differently to this. In Thailand, most unions have been very reluctant to recruit foreign workers, in part because many of the foreign workers in Thailand are actually there as economic or human rights refugees rather than as formally recognised migrant workers. There's a great deal of cultural prejudice against the Burmese, who are the primary group there, but also because unions are really weak and they're not always present in even the locations where workers are working. So, for example, before Myanmar opened, before closing again, there was a really big industry developed on the Thai-Burma border. It was many garment factories that were actually staffed by Burmese migrants, but were in Thailand. And the local union had no local workers there, so it didn't have a branch. So effectively for the Burmese migrant workers in that context, there was simply no union to join. You have a very different approach in a place like Malaysia, where in a number of sectors, migrant workers are so much of the workforce in unionised sectors that you ignore them at your own peril. So we can see a number of examples where unions have, because they see no option, actually reached out to migrant workers. One of these is the Timber Workers Union in Peninsular Malaysia, which with the support of BWI started organising migrant workers in about 2009. And by 2013, those migrant workers actually represented about 15% of their dues-paying members. That union also helped support the development of new unions in Peninsular Malaysia that also made a big effort to recruit migrant workers. Another example is in the port sector, where a port union that used to really focus on white-collar clerical workers was basically at risk of just disappearing. So it made the decision to open its membership to blue-collar workers, most of whom were actually foreign workers. And in a very short period, migrant workers came to represent quite a large proportion of a much larger membership than it had before. Another example is in electronics, where an electronics workers union really had to recruit foreign workers if it was going to get the 50% at the workplace level it needed to engage. The trouble was then, and this is a risk in many sectors, that the employer just simply started sacking the migrant workers who had joined the union. So this strategy isn't without difficulties, but these three examples from Malaysia show that where there is a will, there is often a way, and in actually reaching out to those migrant workers, those local unions are improving their own strategies, which then they can use for also to better serve their local members. In other countries in Asia, separate organising is possible. In Taiwan, this is quite new. As I mentioned before, Hong Kong, it's very established, and it's also possible in South Korea. And so then you've got a bigger question. You have to decide whether you're going to try to organise in your mainstream affiliates or whether you're going to establish separate organisations. And without wanting at all to downplay how much work it is to engage in separate organising, it has a very different impact for both the workers involved, the temporary labour migrants involved, but also for the union. We can see this in Taiwan, where there's a couple now migrant-only unions, but they came out of the NGOs movement that supported them. They were formally registered, but because they're not actually tied to mainstream unions, their industrial influence is almost zero. So they actually end up working more like an informal association, providing mutual aid, maybe some insurance and so on, rather than becoming bargaining agents or collective vehicles through the formal industrial relations system. Japan's a bit different. In Japan, as I said before, it's not actually possible to separately organise. but some small unions in Japan and some community groups that are trying to support migrant workers have formed unions or branches of unions that are basically migrant only. And again, they do some really valuable work, but they don't actually help integrate migrant workers into mainstream industrial relations, and therefore their impact is quite marginal. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Singapore. And in Singapore, as in Malaysia, as in Thailand, you can't organise separately. And the difference in Singapore, I think the main one, is that the government actually controls the unions to a large extent, and it is also very pro-migrant worker. So echoing that pro-migrant worker discourse, the mainstream unions have actually long been very positive about temporary labour migrants and have actively recruited them to their unions. So, for example, in the mid-2000s, foreigners actually constituted 18% of the whole union movement in Singapore. And in some unions, they were up to 80% in particular workplaces. And the main areas we're talking about here are the construction union, which also covers activities like cleaning and that sort of activity, as well as construction, the seafarers union, and also another maritime union. So they're very particular sectors, but within those sectors, temporary labour migrants are really well represented, and the unions actually do a good job for them within the confines of what they do for their normal members. So they have the access to the same kinds of factory, supermarket discounts, insurance training and so on. They don't have much industrial power because the unions don't have much industrial power. So this is a really interesting example, and in both this case but also the Malaysian cases I was talking about, these migrant workers are actually paying dues, which is also another part of the equation that we need to consider. Okay, so having considered those examples, let's consider the question straight on about whether migrant labour organising represents a renewal pathway. And I think you probably already know the answer to this, but just for me to recap. These different ways of engaging through advocacy, through servicing, through separate organising, through integrated organising, all have different demands and different potential outcomes. And while advocacy and servicing are very important and have actually achieved a lot, both through unions themselves and in conjunction with NGOs for migrant workers, they also are very limited in terms of promoting renewal. So at best, they help workers, union members and their unions be more open to foreigners, less xenophobic, and maybe better when they meet people on the shop floor. But they don't actually challenge the union to change the way they do. So in contexts where unions are weak and maybe not engaging much with their grassroots membership, this is a really big opportunity that is lost to actually push it further and start thinking about the way you engage with all members and then how that may affect the way you engage with migrants. In terms of organising itself, as we've discussed, we need to differentiate here between separate organising and integrated organising. And separate organising can be really beneficial for migrant workers, but it doesn't actually promote the sorts of changes within the unions that we'd associate with renewal. As we see in both the Hong Kong case and the Korean case, even quite strong unions in the case of Korea, quite militant unions, have not really been able to get over that barrier. That's partly to do with context, partly to do with attitude and internal resourcing, and actually get migrant workers, temporary labour migrants, into mainstream unions. So instead, they've gone down the separate organising pathway, which is symbolically important, but really hasn't affected that much change, and again, has been good in some ways for foreign workers, but really hasn't achieved the big picture items that you'd really want to achieve on their behalf. In terms of integrated organising, really Singapore offers one model where foreign workers are very well integrated into the structures of some unions, but that has not demanded any kind of renewal. And instead we see that they have the access to the same kinds of programs and resources that local unionists have. Where we really want to finish, though, is with the cases in Malaysia, where we can see that substantive engagement with temporary labour migrants can actually contribute to union renewal. not in isolation, but actually by forcing change within core union functions, which not only benefits the temporary labour migrants, but also the other members of those unions.
Great. So our long distance thanks to Michele, again, who's unfortunately unable to join us for the time zone difference. So with that, I'll turn it over to our third and final speaker for this open plenary session, Chidi King. Chidi is the director of the Equality Department at the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, where she addresses issues such as gender equality and intersectionality and the global governance of migration. Chidi graduated in law from the University of Birmingham from the Inns of Court School of Law, now the City Law School. Chidi's talk is titled, How Trade Unions Fight for Migrants and What We Can Do Better. Chidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Praveen and of course to Michele for their interventions. Hard acts to follow, but I will do my best. I was saying again that situating the struggle by trade unions to organize and defend the rights of migrant workers does need to be contextualized. And I think that was already done very well through the last presentation. And of course, the essential mission of trade unions is building the power of the working class, which is a prerequisite to social justice and democracy. Capital's power to impose terms and conditions from above can only really be limited by the collective struggles of the working class. And that can only be effective if the working class is united. And I think we heard in previous presentations how indeed, the labor of migrants is often used to divide the power of the working class. And we can't really talk about how trade unions are organizing migrant workers without acknowledging those tensions that do exist and that play out within trade unions themselves, the tensions that serve to create division, to raise suspicion, to feed anger, which in turn feeds racism and xenophobia, which is rampant in society and often fueled by political positioning, the expediency of using the presence of migrants to create division, both within society and, of course, within trade unions. This also enables and mainstreams far-right ideology and the propagation of far-right groups. That said, I think it's also important to point out that there are many examples throughout history of trade unions and indeed migrant workers, either within trade unions or working alongside trade unions, coming together to defeat these types of ideologies, but also to improve working conditions for all. One particular example that springs to mind in fairly recent history, I would say, would have been the struggles of Asian migrant women in the UK, in particular, to ensure that their rights were respected, but also to overturn the racist tools, indeed, that were being used to deny them their rights and their voice in trade unions. I wouldn't go into too much detail about the different models of organizing, because again, I think that was set out very well in the previous presentation. But I think what it would be important to say is that these are not mutually exclusive. Very often we see trade unions using a servicing model to attract migrant workers into the organization to better incorporate and integrate them into the organizations. And advocacy always has a role to play in terms of building that collective power, in terms of integrating the issues and the challenges faced by migrant workers into national frameworks to protect the rights of all workers.
And again, the organizing aspect is the most challenging aspect indeed, as was previously pointed out. The issues around availability of resources, the issues around the capacity of trade unions, particularly in a context now, I mean, it's not a particularly new context, but perhaps it's even more acute now, where there is extremely low trade union density, where trade unions are facing the ever increasing deregulation and degradation of work, at the center of which, of course, are attacks on the rights and ability of workers to organize themselves. You have to place that alongside, again, workers who are very often concerned, afraid about their own conditions, who see, unfortunately, and it's not just migrant workers, but see whoever happens to be in a minority group of workers, if I can put it that way, as the other. And rather than an issue which it's incumbent and urgent on trade unions to address. This can only be done through ultimately a worker empowerment model. So again, going back to models such as the servicing model or advocacy models, they certainly do have a place, but without empowering migrant workers within trade unions, and that's not just about recruiting them into trade unions, but ensuring that they can play an active role within the trade unions, ensuring that they can define the issues of most importance to them within trade unions, ensuring that they can participate in bargaining units within trade unions, through which they can indeed raise the issues that are fundamental to them, and ensuring that they have access to leadership positions within trade union structures. Again, all of this is quite easy to say, much more difficult to realize in practice. And again, trade unions very often are not just facing the challenge of educating their own members, not only facing the challenge of countering what is often the prevailing rhetoric, if I can put it that way, when it comes to migrant workers, but I could just as easily say as well when it comes to Black workers or racialized workers, or indeed in many instances when it comes to women workers, and not only faced with the challenge of having to educate their members to root out sentiments of discrimination or hostility from their members, but they're also faced with very often policy and legal frameworks which inhibit them in reaching out to migrant workers, enabling them to organize migrant workers effectively, and indeed even blocking them from having migrant workers within their leadership structures. That said, let's focus perhaps on some of the positive examples of where trade unions have been working to face these challenges and indeed to overcome those challenges. I can point to some national examples, for instance, the FLY CGIL collaboration, whereby workers and predominantly migrant workers in the agricultural industry and in the food processing industry in Italy are organized by the CGIL into the trade union, giving them the ability to effectively protect, defend, and promote their individual, but most importantly, their collective rights as workers. We've also seen some innovative practices by this type of collaboration. The idea that you have to go and meet migrant workers where they are. So the caravans, for instance, that FLY and CGIL have put in place to make sure that union organizers are out early in the morning, going to talk to day laborers before they are met by potential employers or recruiters to try to organize them into the union. That of itself has significant challenges, but it's certainly a model that has shown itself to be effective. We've seen, for example, the collaboration between the Justice for Domestic Workers organization in the UK and the Union, again, enabling largely migrant domestic workers to organize themselves and also to have a say and a real voice within trade union organizing. And these are, again, models which, going back to the presentation that we had from Michele, so these are models which are not examples necessarily of totally separate organizing, but perhaps more of self-organizing within trade unions. And perhaps this is another model that trade unions need to be looking at more deeply. How can we enable organizations of migrant workers to participate fully within the trade union, but self-organize themselves within the trade union to have a more powerful voice within that trade union. We've seen this type of organizing with other groups of workers, with women workers, for example, with Black and ethnic minority workers. And whilst it has some controversies attached to it, it has certainly proved quite effective in giving often marginalized groups of workers a say within trade unions and a place within their own organizations of trade unions. We've also seen, I'll come back a little bit later to the issues of advocacy and perhaps servicing, but I just also wanted to talk about the importance of transnational organizing. When it comes to migration, you can't be confined only within national borders. Another significant challenge for trade unions, but we have seen, I would say in the past decade, trade unions stepping up more and more to that challenge, to organizing themselves in a way which strengthens cross-border collaborations. We've seen, for instance, the establishment of regional networks. In Africa, we have the ATUMNet, so the African Trade Union Migration Network. We have the similar networks operating in Latin America, more on a sub-regional basis. We have, even within Europe, through the European Trade Union Confederation, the Union Migration Network. And we have, very interestingly, the example of the RSMMS, which has been a network which is autonomous. It's been organized by trade union organizations and confederations themselves. And very interestingly, fostering collaboration predominantly between trade unions in Europe and trade unions or Mediterranean Europe, although that's expanding now, and unions in sub-Saharan Africa. Today comprises, I think, more than 30 trade union organizations, which enables the exchange of information between trade unions in different parts of the world, which is fundamental, not only to understanding the challenges, understanding the trends, understanding what may be coming down the road, so being more proactive in trying to counter some of the difficulties that may arise, but also in developing strategies to organize migrant workers, being able to exchange what has worked, what has been efficient, and what perhaps can be replicated elsewhere. And this has been crucial, particularly in this current context, because we can't ignore the context of COVID, where we have seen the deficits that migrant workers too often experience in terms of their work relationships and in terms of their participation in the labor force, brought even more into the fore, but also exacerbated. We have seen, for example, and it's given us, pointers, indications as to where trade unions need to focus more of their efforts. We've seen issues around the fact that so many migrant workers who do not enjoy, and it's not exclusive to migrant workers, we see this with many workers, full stop, navigating with this deregulation and degradation of work I spoke earlier, being robbed of social protection, basic social protection, basic labor rights, and how the pandemic has worsened and exacerbated this. But in the case of migrant workers, we have seen them, very overrepresented already in the sectors that have had to confront the impacts of the pandemic already. So that's our health and social care sectors, our food retail sectors, for instance, our agricultural sector, and yet not having access to basic, protections, including health and safety protections and personal protective equipment. We've seen too many migrant workers, again, because they are in precarious jobs or because they're in temporary or circular migration schemes, find themselves without work overnight and literally stranded. So, being in a no person's land, not being able to return to their countries of origin and being completely excluded from any measures that have been put in place by national governments to deal with the impacts, the socioeconomic and health impacts of the pandemic. We've seen unions scrambling to try to ensure that, for example, their temporary amnesties extended to migrants who were either undocumented before or who have become undocumented because of tied visa arrangements that came along with their jobs that disappeared with the arrival of the pandemic. So again, this gives us pointers on areas where trade unions absolutely need to focus efforts more. But again, coming back to the issue of the need to build solidarity and to strengthen the worker education that happens within trade unions, the pandemic again exposes the urgent need for that. Because without that, and I see perhaps is that my 5 minute speech?
That's,
okay,
that's the second one, just to know. So that if you could be wrapping up, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that very quickly. So just again to say that we have seen again over the past decade or two the rise of the far-right ideology that I spoke of before. We're seeing that exacerbated through the socioeconomic impacts of this pandemic. And again, if we don't as trade unions turn our attention urgently to this, then we're going to have a worsening of situation for all workers. I did want to, in conclusion, just touch on a couple of things that the ITUC and the global union federations are doing in terms of organizing ourselves around, advocacy, but also the issue of organizing migrant workers. So at global level, we have the Council of Global Unions. I know that Ambit Yusen will be speaking to you later on, but that brings together the global union federations who are particularly active around issues of migrant workers' rights, which indeed adopted a manifesto which looks really at encouraging all our affiliates to make sure that they are organizing migrant workers, that they are fighting racism and xenophobia, and that they are building solidarity between migrants and non-migrant workers. There's advocacy, of course, that happens at the level of the International Labour Organization as well. So we've had new guidelines adopted in the past few years that look at recruitment or fair recruitment of migrant workers and looking at the situation of refugees and asylum seekers in the labour market and seeking to ensure their rights. And of course, we've had the Global Compact on migration, where trade unions again came together to organize to ensure that issues such as decent work were central, and trade unions are again engaging in the follow-up processes to the Global Compact on migration. I can't end without talking about the ITUC's migrant recruitment advisor tool, which is working to promote fair recruitment of migrant workers, again, made even more urgent by the pandemic, where we're operating in an environment of high unemployment, where the competition for jobs has intensified, both domestically and abroad, where in fact the job market has indeed been decimated, and where there's a lack still of strong and effective workers' organizations. As I mentioned before, the Recruitment Advisor is a global peer-to-peer recruitment review platform, which provides accurate information on recruitment to both prospective migrant workers and workers who are already living and working in countries of destination, but also provides a complaints mechanism, which is managed by Migrant Forum in Asia. And I know that William Goyce is with us today. And then finally, just to say that the ITC and the ILO will be conducting a global webinar actually on migration and technology on the 30th of March, which will be spotlighting the work of the MRA and how it can work effectively as a tool for organizing migrant workers in defense of their own rights, particularly when it comes to the recruitment process and the huge abuses that can occur along that process. Okay, I'll stop there. Apologies if I went over my time.
No worries, Chidi. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And on that last one, if that's an open event, maybe you could post the link to it in chat. That would be wonderful. So now we have, I guess, just around 10 minutes, more, maybe a little bit more. So we're going to have to be very efficient. I'm going to maybe go with 2 priority questions, one for each of the 2 speakers we have with us. First, let me emphasize what Nicola had mentioned at the beginning. We will be opening now, right, this virtual whiteboard mural, so participants can note ideas, comments, and post links to useful resources there. And we will post the link to that whiteboard in the chat. So with that, let me pull over my other screen and get to the questions here. Again, there's a lot of great questions, a lot of great comments in the chat. So we encourage you to look at those because we're not going to be able to cover them. But let me go back to Praveen with one question, and then Chidi, I have a question that I'll follow up with you. And again, for time to be as efficient as possible with the responses. Praveen, this is a question from Nicolas Fernandez. The question goes as follows, a couple parts of the question. What is the contemporary relevance of race and ethnicity in the issue of migrant work? For the case of Argentina, a country with a relatively progressive migration legislation, race stands as the invisible frontier. And most Bolivian workers know how different is their migration experiences from those coming from Italy. This is obviously an example, but realistic. It touches closely on what Dr. Praveen Jha mentioned as the common background between the right wing and progressive movements. How can we properly measure its relevance while not reinforcing the problem of over-racializing? Praveen, so.
I think Nicola has already answered his question. And with respect to the example which he gave, he has also illustrated it. So the importance of race and ethnicity and several other aspects of what I like to call social geography. You know, in different parts of the world, you have a whole range of fault lines, and these impact on the labor question, on migration in massive ways. So, you know, I think we don't have time to illustrate how in different parts it impacts the actual concrete processes, but we can give you several examples. If we had time, you know, then we can talk of different continents and different countries and so on and so forth, right? Okay, Mark, so is that okay for a short answer?
That's very well done, Praveen. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yes.
And so, Chidi, back to you now. This is from Arturo Ruiz, who asks, how can international solidarity among organized workers influence organizing migrant workers in countries where even local workers are not respected?
Thank you, and thank you, Arturo, for that question. That goes really to the heart of the challenge. Really, is indeed how do you, and it's not just internationally. I would say, how do you even start to build that kind of solidarity and understanding between workers at national level when workers' rights are generally not respected. So I think the challenge starts there. And centering the fight or the struggle for migrant workers' rights within the purpose, as I said earlier, of trade unions. So the fundamental mission of trade unions to tackle exploitation and to fight for social justice and democracy, I think is key. And that applies to international solidarity as well. Again, I think key to that is the cross-border collaboration between trade unions, having trade unions in countries of origin, in countries of transit, which often get left out, but are very important. Because remember that transit can be anything from, a day, a week to 2 years. You can find, migrant workers in this situation, and then unions in countries of destination is crucial. But linking that as well to the fight for equality and the fight against the rise of racism and xenophobia internationally, I think is absolutely crucial and fundamental. Many of the groups that we're seeing now and political parties embracing this ideology have been able to do so on the backs of migrant workers, on the backs of other marginalized groups. So that international cooperation, exchanging of information, exchanging of strategies, I would say is absolutely crucial, not only to strengthening the rights of migrant workers themselves, but to strengthening the rights of all workers generally. It's not, change won't come through rhetoric alone, but it's not simple rhetoric, the trade union motto that an injury to one is an injury to all. Wherever you have a link in the chain that can be abused, that can be, attacked, it weakens, workers all over.
Very precise and helpful answer. Appreciate both. So let me pull this over so I'm not looking at my other screen here. Praveen, back to you. Here's a short one from Steffi Matthew. Is there an effective squeeze of labor demand on a global level? And he adds, I'm not sure if I had understood this correctly.
Yes, indeed. If you look at the evidence from various major reports, whether coming from institutions like the ILO or World Bank or whatever, what you are told is that there is a secular tendency of squeeze on labor demand for almost 5 decades. There are some cyclical shifts up and down here and there, but there is a secular tendency for almost 5 decades. By 1980s, towards the end of 1980s, every relevant major institution globally was talking of jobless growth. Growth itself had come down, but along with that, what we had witnessed, and we continue to witness that, is a tendency of squeeze on labor. In fact, in some parts of the world, it has become job loss growth. Let me give you just one example to illustrate it. India and China, they sort of account for almost 38% of the global labor force. Right? Now, in India, which is roughly half of that, slightly less than half of this total that I mentioned, if you look at 1980s, at a rate of growth which was somewhat less compared to today's GDP growth rate, what has happened is that we have come to a situation of labor shedding. So in the last 4 or 5 years, there is in fact a strange situation of reasonable growth rate of about 5-6% or so, but labor absorption is actually going down. So that's one indicator. Likewise, if you look at any region in the world, any particular geographical region, what you are sort of demonstrated, shown by the data and so on, is what is known as declining elasticity of employment. So that is growth. Whatever employment it generated earlier, that has come down. That is what it means to say sort of the elasticity has gone down. So this is something which is very well established, every part of the world and so on. So yes.
Great. Thank you, Praveen. So Chidi, one question from you, and this comes from Cynthia, who's one of our Blue graduates. She asked how trade unions can address the problem of vaccination regarding the immigrant workers and the ones involved in the informal sector. And amongst the unemployment rate, how to prevent changes in the labor laws that use the pandemic as a motive to decrease labor protection.
Oh, that's quite a question. I don't know how much time we have left to try to address that. But I think, sincerely, this is not an easy question for trade unions to navigate. Trade unions were going to have to position themselves in a way that makes it very clear has access to the vaccine, whilst defending people's rights to bodily integrity as well, without falling into the camp of the naysayers of vaccines. So it's one thing to ensure that there's no discrimination in the way that vaccines are distributed. And when it comes to migrant populations and informal workers, the public health side of this is particularly important. You can't have sections of society or populations vaccinated and expect that entire populations or societies will then be protected from the effects of this pandemic. At the same time, again, we're already seeing employers saying that they will refuse to hire workers who have not had the vaccine. So that's a really fine line that needs to be walked. We have to argue against this becoming a condition of work, because we know that those who are going to be most affected by this type of condition are going to be those who are already largely excluded from or marginalized in our world of work, in our labor markets. But again, we also have to have an eye to what it means if you do not also defend people's rights to have a say in terms of their own health and what they will allow in terms of infringements of their rights to bodily integrity, or decisions, that autonomy over decisions about their own health and what goes into their bodies, if I can put it that way. It's not an easy equation. It's not an easy line to walk, but it's one that trade unions will have to walk.
Thank you. Very important points. Let me just also, in addition to thanking our three speakers for their wonderful and very insightful presentations, I also want to thank Reshaping Work, most especially Duigu and Giovanna for their outstanding work and helping us organize this in such a fluid and professional way. And I'd also add a special thanks to the interpreters who have done just an absolutely wonderful job. I've done a bit of it. I know how hard that work is, and without you, we wouldn't be able to be communicating across the globe. So my thanks to you. Be safe, be well, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.